The global policies question is interesting. So I'll answer that first because I think it's a little bit more complicated than the executive orders from the US. But we've seen a few different things manifest in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks, which I find interesting on a global scale. One is that Germany has essentially finally capitulated to France and allowed nuclear, as far as Germany goes, to be included as a green energy source. And this doesn't seem like much, but what it really means is finally the primary, with an exception of Austria, the primary anti-nuclear country within the EU bloc has officially flipped and said, okay, nuclear is green and we are going to call it green. So basically that means that these last holdout countries are finally shifting. That opens up the possibility for them to restart reactors, which is possible. Of course, if they do, that will equal new demand that nobody is modeling for. We've also seen Spain go through a kind of a historic countrywide blackout. That what it seems like triggered that was too much intermittency and insufficient, let's say, insufficient firmness of the energy source in Spain. And now we're seeing a couple of the utilities that are nuclear operators in Spain push for their reactors to be life extended. So Spain's fleet is 8 reactors. They are all set to close by 2035, and the first one's in the next couple of years. So they might even flip. Lastly, I'll say that Kazakhstan is looking at building nuclear power. They're getting bids from primarily the Russians and the Chinese, and that's really interesting to see because the Chinese are coming in and say, we're going to build you 2 reactors. It's going to cost less than $6 billion for both, and we'll get it done in 5 years. And it's hard to say no to that type of offer. It's incredible, and the Chinese can probably do it. But part of this is that they're saying that the country of Kazakhstan is saying that they intend to build a strategic uranium reserve for the purpose of securing fuel for their own nuclear reactors. And I think this is really interesting because China has already been doing this. They have the biggest inventory. Of course, China is going to consume almost 1 billion pounds of uranium in the next 15 years, but they have established a uranium reserve. Will Kazakhstan do it? Will the US do it? Will France do it? And all of these countries that are relying from a national security perspective on nuclear power should, and many of them likely will, establish reserves. That is secondary demand that nobody is modeling for, but it's going to be something. Lastly, I'll answer the executive order question briefly, just to summarize it all. 4 different executive orders were signed to reinvigorate the supply chain for nuclear, to reform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And there's 2 others that are along that thematic, essentially involving the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, reiterating that the Department of Energy's loan program is going to remain in place. The funding for that, we're not sure yet until we see the finalization of the Senate bill. But the loan program remaining is very good. Some carve-outs from the Inflation Reduction Act were included in the House bill that passed. We still are waiting to see the size and the amount of tax credits and whether or not the investment tax credits will remain with the Senate bill. Big fingers crossed on that. A lot of entities are pushing very hard for those tax credits to remain. I would say the most notably bullish, for lack of a better word, but really the most visible piece of these executive orders for the nuclear and uranium front is essentially that in one of the executive orders, they are requiring that by 2030, we will see 10 large reactors at least begin construction with finalized designs. So important that that's part of the language, because Vogtle 3 and 4 began construction without the design actually being finalized. That led to a lot of problems and a lot of cost and schedule overruns for Vogtle, especially Vogtle 3. Once Vogtle 3 was built, Vogtle 4 went much, much faster, much cheaper than 3. So they're saying you got to have the designs finalized and you got to have shovels in the ground by 2030 for 10 new large reactors. And that's a big signal because the US hasn't built anything besides Vogtle 3 and 4 since 1978 when the NRC was established. And so this reaffirmation of the NRC, it's a little bit controversial. And they're basically saying you have to look at radiation not as an absolute zero in terms of risk, but you have to balance that with the risk of not building any more nuclear, which we need. So clear the administration is very, very behind this with these executive orders. Now we wait for the Senate bill to be finalized to see exactly what's in it. and supportive of nuclear, but moving in the right direction, absolutely, for new builds in the US. And that's a big signal to the globe.